Your wife all along planned to take over your company with her lover.
I saw the signs only recently. We can still save the company.
He didn't lose everything in one moment. He lost it slowly, the way a fire consumes a house, starting in a room you never visit, spreading through the walls while you sleep, until the whole structure collapses around you, and all that's left is ash, and the terrible realization that the smoke had been there all along. David Mercer was 41 years old when his life fell apart. And the cruelest part? He built the very hands that tore it down. Picture a man who seems to have been assembled by the universe in a moment of rare generosity. David was not extraordinarily handsome or extraordinarily brilliant. He was something rarer. He was good. The kind of good that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in small, unremarkable moments. Staying late to help a junior employee finish a proposal. Remembering the name of a delivery driver's daughter. Driving 40 minutes out of his way to bring soup to a neighbor he barely knew when she had surgery. He had grown up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the son of a machinist and a schoolteacher. His parents had not given him wealth. They had given him something more durable. A code. Work hard. Keep your word. Take care of your people. Those 4 sentences had become the architecture of his entire life. At 26, David had started Mercer Industrial Solutions from a rented office space the size of a generous closet, with 2 folding chairs, a second-hand desk, and a phone that rang 6 times a day if he was lucky. The company provided engineering consulting and supply chain management for mid-size manufacturers. Not glamorous work, but necessary, precise, and deeply satisfying to a man who believed in the dignity of things that were made well. He had not built it alone. Marcus Webb had been his college roommate, his best man, his business partner, and, David believed with complete sincerity, his brother in every way that mattered. They had met freshman year over a shared disdain for the cafeteria's meatloaf and an equal enthusiasm for late-night poker, and 20 years later, nothing between them had dimmed. Marcus was the kind of friend who answered the phone at 2 a.m. without complaint, who remembered the anniversary of David's father's death and always called on that day, who could make David laugh harder than anyone alive with a single well-timed look. Marcus was the head of operations at Mercer Industrial. He handled the internal machinery of the company, vendor relationships, staffing, logistics, while David handled clients and strategy. It was a partnership built on a mutual understanding, so complete they rarely needed contracts between themselves. They had simply always trusted each other. Some friendships become load-bearing walls, so woven into the structure of your life that you cannot imagine the building standing without them. Marcus was that wall for David. And then there was Elena. David had known Elena Rossi since they were 16 years old, when she sat behind him in AP Chemistry and corrected his lab calculations with a precision that was simultaneously infuriating and breathtaking. He had been in love with her for 25 years. Not the feverish, desperate love of young men, though it had started that way, but the deep, quiet, gravitational love of a person who has become so essential to your understanding of yourself that you no longer know where you end and they begin. Elena was a landscape architect. She designed public parks and private gardens, and there was something in her approach to her work that David had always admired, this patient conviction that beautiful things required time, that you couldn't rush a tree, that every garden needed a plan that accounted for seasons you wouldn't see for years. She was thoughtful in the way that some people are brave, naturally, without performance. They had 2 children, a 15-year-old named Lily, who wanted to be a marine biologist, and a 12-year-old named Sam, who was, in David's completely unbiased assessment, the funniest person he had ever met. By any measure that David understood, his life was extraordinary. He said this sometimes, not boastfully, but with a kind of solemn gratitude, the way a man might count his blessings aloud, not to show them off, but to make sure he hadn't lost track of them. He said it to his mother on Sunday phone calls. He said it late at night to Elena, in the particular quiet that belongs only to married people, the deep dark of a shared bedroom, voices barely above a whisper. "I keep waiting for the catch," he told her once, half joking. She had laughed and told him he was ridiculous. He should have listened to the feeling. The first thing David noticed was small enough that he filed it away without alarm. It was a Thursday in March, a gray afternoon with rain spitting against the office windows, and he was reviewing the quarterly accounts when he found a discrepancy in the vendor payment records. Not a large one, $14,000, attributed to a service provider he didn't recognize. When he asked his bookkeeper, Sheila, about it, she said the invoice had come directly from Marcus, already approved. David noted it, flagged it for follow-up, and promptly forgot about it. Marcus handled operations. There were dozens of vendors David didn't personally know. It meant nothing. But then, a week later, there was another one. $42,000 this time. Same structure. An unfamiliar vendor name, Marcus's approval stamp. David sent Marcus a quick email asking about it, the kind of casual, unconcerned email that passed between partners 100 times a week. Marcus replied within minutes. "New consulting contractor for the Cincinnati expansion. I'll send you the details." The details never came. David sent another email. Marcus replied with a joke about being buried under Cincinnati logistics and promised to get him the paperwork by end of week. End of week became end of month. David, distracted by a major client negotiation, let it slide. Meanwhile, the employees were changing. This was subtler, and it took David longer to name what he was sensing. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was distance. A certain careful quality that entered rooms when he did. A way that conversations seemed to edit themselves in his presence. Laughter dying half a beat too quickly. He noticed that his project manager, a sharp-tongued woman named Brenda, who had always been warmly irreverent with him, had become oddly formal. He noticed that the junior staff in operations, Marcus's domain, looked at him with something that, if he were less trusting, he might have called pity. He mentioned it to his sister Carol over dinner one evening. Carol was a pragmatist of the highest order. A woman who had once told David that intuition was just pattern recognition you hadn't consciously processed yet. "Your gut is trying to tell you something," she said, putting down her fork. "You should listen to it." "My gut is tired," David said. "That's all it is." Carol looked at him for a long moment. "How's Elena?" He paused. And in that pause lived a truth he had not yet allowed himself to look at directly. Elena had changed. Again, the change was quiet, difficult to pin. She was not cruel, or even cold. She was simply less present. There were evenings when he would reach for her in some small, domestic way, touching her shoulder as she cooked, trying to catch her eye over the dinner table, and she would accept the contact with a kind of courteous remoteness, as though she were a very polite stranger being touched by someone she had just met. She was working late more often. She kept her phone face down on tables. When he asked her how she was, she said fine, with the particular flatness of someone who has carefully excavated the word of any meaning it once had. He told himself she was stressed. A major park commission had gone sideways. The kids were at difficult ages. Everyone went through patches. He told himself a great many things. What he did not do, could not do, not yet, was allow himself to consider that the two things might be connected, that the strangeness in the office and the distance in his marriage might share a common origin, that the house was already burning. His father-in-law called him on a Tuesday. Joseph Rossi was 73, a retired civil engineer with calloused hands and a directness that David had always respected. They had a good relationship, the kind where they could talk about real things. "Something's not right with my daughter," Joseph said, without preamble. "She's stressed," David said. "Work has been—" "David?" Joseph's voice was gentle but firm. "I've known Elena for 51 years. I know what stressed looks like on her. This is something else." David gripped the phone. "What are you saying, Joseph?" A long pause. "I'm saying keep your eyes open, son." He hung up and sat alone in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, the engine off, watching the concrete ceiling. Then he drove home, kissed his wife on the cheek, helped Sam with his math homework, and told himself everything was fine. The documents disappeared in April. These were not trivial documents. They were the founding shareholder agreements for Mercer Industrial, the original contracts that established David's 70% ownership stake and Marcus's 30%, along with the operating agreement that required unanimous consent for any transfer of ownership or structural change to the company. David discovered they were missing when he went to retrieve them for a refinancing application with the company's bank. He went to the fireproof cabinet in his office, where they had lived undisturbed for 15 years. The cabinet was there, the folder was there, the documents were gone. He assumed it was a filing error. He asked Sheila. He asked the office manager. He sent a company-wide email requesting anyone who might have moved or scanned the shareholder documents to let him know. No one responded. He asked Marcus. Marcus said he hadn't touched them, but offered to help look, and spent an afternoon making a show of searching filing systems and storage rooms with the thoroughness of a man who already knew he wouldn't find anything. David called his attorney, an old family friend named Raymond, and asked about the digital backups. Raymond checked and found that the backup server's files from that directory had been corrupted, a server error, according to the IT logs, from 3 months prior. It was, David would later understand, not a server error at all. But he wasn't ready to understand that yet. What he was experiencing, in those weeks, was a particular form of cognitive dissonance that happens when the reality in front of you directly contradicts everything you believe to be true about the people you love. The mind, in its desperate loyalty to the world it has constructed, performs extraordinary acrobatics to avoid the conclusion it cannot bear. David found himself generating increasingly complex explanations for increasingly simple evidence, arranging the facts into shapes that kept the people at the center of his life, in the positions he had always assigned them. Marcus was his brother. Elena was his heart. These were not contingencies or probabilities. These were facts, load-bearing, structural, as real to him as gravity. And so when things didn't add up, he blamed the math. Meanwhile, in a restaurant across town that neither of them would ever have chosen for a date, deliberately unremarkable, deliberately far from anyone who might know them, Marcus and Elena met for the 4th time that month. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, speaking quietly and quickly, their heads inclined together, their eyes moving to the door every time it opened. They had been careful. They had been meticulous. They had, between them, constructed an architecture of deception so detailed and so reinforced that it had stood for 11 months without a crack. But architectures of deception share a critical flaw with architectures of everything else. They are only as strong as their weakest point. And the weakest point had a name. His name was Thomas Carr, and he had worked in Marcus's operations department for 4 years, and he had accidentally walked into a conversation he was never supposed to hear. Thomas Carr was 28 years old and possessed of a quality that had made him quietly invaluable in the operations department. He had an extraordinary ability to understand systems. Give him a process, any process, however complex, and he would trace its logic, find its inefficiencies, and identify, with unsettling precision, exactly where and how it could fail. He applied this ability not just to supply chain logistics, but to everything around him, including people. He had noticed the pattern in the vendor payments 8 months ago. He had noticed the private meetings between Marcus and the company's silent partner, a man named Gerard Howell, whose firm, he discovered after some careful searching, had recently filed documents indicating intent to acquire a controlling interest in a mid-size Ohio engineering consultancy. He had noticed that the financial records he was occasionally asked to process showed figures that, when he checked them against the raw transaction data he had access to as a senior operations analyst, didn't match. Thomas had spent 3 months deciding what to do with what he knew. He had a mortgage. He had a 6-month-old daughter. He had watched people in other companies lose their jobs, and worse, for speaking up against people with power. He understood the risks. But Thomas Carr also had a father who had told him, more times than he could count, that the only thing a man truly owns is his integrity. And Thomas had watched David Mercer for 4 years, watched him treat every person in the company with the same consideration regardless of their title, watched him stay late not because he had to, but because his people were working and he felt it wasn't right to leave before them, watched him once quietly pay the funeral expenses for a warehouse worker's family and tell nobody about it. He could not, in good conscience, say nothing. He waited until a Friday afternoon when the office had emptied. He walked to David's office, knocked, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man preparing to jump from a very tall building. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." David looked up from his desk, and something in Thomas's face, the particular quality of its stillness, the way it carried a weight that had clearly been carried for a long time, made David close his laptop and fold his hands and say, quietly, "Go ahead." What Thomas told him in the next 40 minutes changed everything. David sat in his car again that night. He had been doing a lot of that, sitting in his car in the dark, engine off, the city moving indifferently around him. But this time was different. This time, something had fractured in him so cleanly and so completely that he could feel the separate pieces of himself shifting, not yet knowing how to arrange around the new geography of the truth. Thomas had laid out what he knew methodically and without embellishment. The fraudulent vendor accounts, shell companies, David now understood, created by Marcus and routing company funds to a holding account that would eventually be used to purchase Gerard Howell's acquisition stake. The financial records, altered over 14 months, designed to show the company as less profitable than it was, making it easier to justify a valuation that would benefit the buyer. The shareholder documents, whose disappearance was not coincidental, and a forged signature, his own, on a consent form for the ownership restructuring, which had already been filed with the state, but not yet processed. Marcus was selling the company out from under him, piece by piece, document by document, quiet meeting by quiet meeting. He had been doing it for over a year. David sat with this for a long time before the second part came to him. The second part he had been pushing away for months, keeping it in the periphery of his awareness, where things live when you are not ready to look at them directly. He thought about Elena's changed phone habits, her late evenings, the careful remoteness in the way she touched him, her father's call. He thought about how many times Marcus had visited their house for dinner over the past year. How Elena always seemed to know exactly when to expect him, before David had told her. How once, months ago, he had come home early to find Marcus's car in the driveway, and Elena's explanation, that he'd stopped by to drop off some papers, had felt, at the time, entirely reasonable. He thought about the restaurant receipt he had found in Elena's coat pocket in February, on a Tuesday evening when she'd told him she was working late. He had noticed it had been for 2 people, and had thought, vaguely, that she must have had a client dinner. He had not thought about it again until this moment. He drove home slowly, through quiet streets. He walked into his house and stood in the kitchen and looked at the refrigerator covered in the ordinary artifacts of a family life. Sam's drawing of a dolphin with an anatomically optimistic number of teeth, Lily's schedule of swim meets, a grocery list in Elena's handwriting. He had looked at this refrigerator 1,000 times without seeing it. Now he looked at it and felt it like a wound. Elena was upstairs. He could hear her moving. He made himself a cup of tea he didn't drink. He went over it again. Thomas's evidence, the timeline, the receipts, the patterns. He was a methodical man by nature, and method was all he had left. He could not afford to be wrong. He could not afford to confront people he loved based on suspicion and fall apart only to discover he had misunderstood. He needed to be certain. He needed, before he did anything, to know exactly what he was dealing with. He put the tea down, went upstairs, got into bed beside his wife, and said good night, in a voice that he was quietly amazed stayed steady. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to her breathe. Tomorrow, he told himself, be calm, be quiet, know everything before you say anything. Tomorrow I become someone they cannot read. The weeks that followed required from David something he had never known he possessed, an almost surgical capacity for stillness. He came to work each morning with the practiced ease of a man who had no idea what was happening. He attended meetings with Marcus, took his suggestions, laughed at his jokes, met his eyes without flinching. At home, he was present and warm with his children, carefully affectionate with Elena, betraying nothing. Every morning he got up and put on the face of a man who believed his world was intact, and every evening he took it off and worked, quietly and methodically, in the home office he had taken to locking. Thomas continued feeding him information from the inside. David's attorney, Raymond, was brought into the loop, late one evening, in Raymond's private office with the windows shuttered, and Raymond's expression as he listened had told David everything he needed to know about the seriousness of what he was facing. "This is securities fraud, David," Raymond said, "and forgery. This is not a civil matter. I know. You're going to need a forensic accountant, and you're going to need to secure your standing as majority shareholder before any of these transfer documents get processed." "I know." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. "How are you doing?" David considered the question with genuine care. "I'm functioning," he said finally. "I'll fall apart later. Right now I need to be useful." He hired the forensic accountant, a woman named Sandra Park who came recommended by Raymond as the most thorough financial investigator in the state. Sandra spent 10 days reviewing everything Thomas had provided, along with the original bank records, which David quietly obtained. Her findings were comprehensive and damning. 14 months of systematic financial manipulation, totaling just over $3 million in fraudulently diverted funds. The forged signature on the ownership transfer consent form, and a paper trail leading directly and irrefutably to Marcus Webb and to Gerard Howell's acquisition company. On a Wednesday evening, Sandra spread her findings across Raymond's conference table in neat color-coded binders, and she looked at David with the particular directness of someone who respects a person enough not to soften their conclusions. "This is airtight," she said. "Every transaction, every forged document. We have the originals against the forgeries. We have the shell company registrations. We have the wire transfer records. There is no version of this that Marcus walks away from intact." David nodded. He looked at the binders on the table. $3 million. 14 months. 20 years of friendship. "There's one more thing," Raymond said carefully. He slid a document across the table. "We've identified a second party who was aware of and actively facilitated the ownership transfer process." David looked at the document. He didn't need to read the name at the top, because he already knew it, Elena Mercer. He had known it was coming. He had built himself up to it, constructed a wall inside himself to contain it when it arrived. But knowing a blow is coming and being able to absorb it when it lands are different things, and David sat at that conference table for a long time without speaking, the room very quiet around him, Raymond and Sandra watching him with the careful attention of people watching a man on a ledge. "How much did she know?" David asked. His voice was very even. "Enough," Sandra said quietly. "The documentation shows she authorized the use of a joint account to front one of the shell company payments. Whether she understood the full scope of the fraud or was only complicit in the relationship aspect." "The relationship aspect," David repeated softly. He closed his eyes, opened them, picked up a pen, put it down. "Okay," he said. "What do we do next?" The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in June. It was, on its face, an ordinary quarterly review, the kind of meeting David had attended dozens of times in his company's history, sitting at the head of a table he had bought with the first real profit Mercer Industrial had ever generated, surrounded by people who, in different measures and for different reasons, had a stake in what happened to the company. Marcus had called the meeting. He had framed it as a strategic review, and he had done so with his characteristic confidence. The easy, warm, managerial authority that David now understood had been carefully curated to position him as the company's natural leader in the eyes of its board, its employees, and its external partners. Over the past year, piece by piece, Marcus had been replacing David's presence with his own, shifting the gravity of the company's daily life from its founder to his operations chief, so that when the ownership transfer finally registered and Gerard Howell's acquisition completed, the transition would seem not like a theft but like an inevitability. David arrived first. He had not slept well in weeks, but you would not have known it from looking at him. He wore the charcoal suit he reserved for the most serious meetings of his professional life. He had shaved carefully. He had eaten breakfast. He had sat with Lily and Sam for 30 minutes that morning, longer than usual, and when Sam had asked why he was being weird, David had laughed and ruffled his hair and said he just liked spending time with them, which was the truest thing he had said in weeks. Raymond and Sandra were already in the building, in a conference room down the hall, waiting. Thomas was at the meeting as an operations representative, sitting 3 chairs to David's left, his face arranged in studied neutrality, his heart, David suspected, probably doing something athletic. The board members filed in. 5 people, all of whom David had known for years, all of whom Marcus had spent the last several months cultivating. Lunches, calls, careful suggestions that the company needed new energy at the top. Marcus arrived last. He came in with his coat still on, moving with the relaxed assurance of a man who believed this meeting was the final act of a plan a year in the making, and he sat down across from David and smiled. The same easy, uncomplicated smile David had known for 20 years, and said, "Ready to get into it?" "Absolutely," David said. The meeting began. Marcus guided the early agenda items with practiced efficiency. Regional performance numbers, Q2 client retention figures, an overview of the Cincinnati expansion. David listened. He asked a question here, made a note there. He was, to all appearances, simply present. And then Marcus reached the item he had been building toward. Framed as a strategic restructuring proposal, he presented it with a PowerPoint deck that must have taken days to prepare. Polished, professional, full of projections and partnership synergies, and the language of opportunity. At its heart was a proposal to bring in an operational investment partner, Gerard Howell's firm, that would, through a transfer of equity currently pending state registration, assume a majority ownership stake in the company and install new executive leadership. He spoke for 12 minutes. He was very good. David gave him that. When he finished, there was a moment of held silence in the room. One of the board members began to speak. David said, quietly, "Before we continue, I'd like to share some information." He reached into the folder in front of him and began to distribute documents. Not all of them, just the first layer, the one with the clearest and most irrefutable numbers. The forensic accounting summary, the shell company registrations, the wire transfer records with Marcus's authorization signatures. He watched Marcus's face as the documents landed. Something happened to Marcus Webb's expression in that moment that David had never seen happen to it before in 20 years of close friendship. The ease left it. The confidence left it. What remained was naked and not pretty, a kind of desperate recalibration, the face of a man watching a structure he built very carefully beginning to collapse in the wrong direction. "These documents," David said, still quietly, still evenly, "represent 14 months of systematic financial fraud against Mercer Industrial Solutions, orchestrated by our head of operations with the assistance of an outside acquisition company. They represent the diversion of $3 million of company funds through shell companies. They represent a forged ownership consent form bearing my signature, a signature I did not provide." He paused. "And they were compiled by a forensic accounting firm working independently with full access to our original financial records, in a process overseen by the company's legal counsel, who is available down the hall if anyone would like to speak with him." The room had gone completely still. One of the board members, a woman named Helen, who had been on the board for 9 years and whom David had always trusted for her directness, was looking at Marcus with an expression that had moved, in 30 seconds, from confusion to something very close to horror. "Marcus," she said. Not a question, just his name, placed in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at David, and then he did something David had not expected, something that, in its own awful way, clarified everything. He didn't deny it. He didn't explode or deflect or reach for an alternative explanation. He said very quietly, "David, I can explain." "I know you can," David said. "I've heard your explanations for a year." Raymond was called in. The state's documentation for the ownership transfer, which had not yet been officially processed, was formally contested and blocked. Gerard Howell's acquisition attempt, stripped of its documentation basis and facing a fraud investigation, collapsed within the week. Marcus's position at the company was terminated by unanimous board vote before the meeting ended. Helen, who ran the board's governance committee with the efficiency of a woman who had seen too much in her career to be sentimental about necessary actions, moved through the procedural requirements with a thoroughness that David was quietly grateful for. He sat through all of it with the stillness he had spent weeks cultivating. When it was over, when the last board member had filed out, and Thomas had shaken his hand, and Raymond had clapped him on the shoulder, and Sandra had quietly packed her binders, David sat alone at the head of his table in the empty room and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to be still without performance. He thought about a night 20 years ago when he and Marcus had driven through a snowstorm to get to Marcus's sister's birthday party, the car sliding on ice, both of them laughing too hard to be properly afraid, the heater broken, Marcus singing badly to the radio. He let himself grieve that. He let himself hold the full weight of it without explanation or defense, the loss of a man he had loved. Then he put it down. The months that followed were the most difficult of his life, and also, in ways he could not have anticipated, the most clarifying. The legal processes were long and ugly. Marcus's attorney negotiated, and there were documents to sign and depositions to give, and meetings David emerged from, feeling hollowed out in ways sleep could barely repair. Elena retained her own attorney. The marriage, which had ended months before either of them said so aloud, was dissolved over 12 careful, painful months. David was present for his children in ways he had never quite managed before, not because he was a better man suddenly, but because when everything else is stripped away, you understand instinctively what actually matters, and Lily and Sam mattered more than breath. He moved into a smaller house 5 minutes from the family home, so the children could come and go easily. He did not move across town or across the country, though some mornings the urge to simply be somewhere else, somewhere that didn't carry the specific weight of this particular grief, was almost overpowering. He stayed because staying was the right thing, and David Mercer was still, despite everything, a man who did the right thing. Marcus eventually took a plea agreement in the fraud case. He was sentenced to 3 years probation, ordered to repay the diverted funds over 7 years, and permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any company in the state. He moved to another city. David did not see him again. Gerard Howell's acquisition company was investigated and settled with the State Securities Commission. The settlement was substantial. Some of that money found its way back to Mercer Industrial, and Mercer Industrial survived. It survived because Thomas Core turned out to have, beneath his systems analysis mind, a genuine instinct for leadership that David had been too comfortable in his existing structure to notice sooner. It survived because Helen proved to be, in the aftermath, one of the wisest advisors David had ever sat across a table from. It survived because the clients who mattered, the ones who had always come for the quality and not just the efficiency, stayed. David restructured. He brought in a new operations director, someone from outside, someone he spent 4 months interviewing and 3 months working alongside before trusting. He rebuilt the financial controls from the ground up with Sandra's guidance. He hired a governance specialist to ensure that what had happened to the shareholder documents could never happen again. He worked harder than he had ever worked, not from desperation, but from a kind of renewed clarity, the clarity that comes when you understand, in your body and not just your mind, what you are working for and why. A year after the board meeting, he took Lily and Sam on a trip they had been talking about for years. 2 weeks in New Zealand, hiking and kayaking and eating spectacular food, and staying in places that were gloriously, deliberately far from email. Lily saw a seal and cried from happiness. Sam attempted to negotiate with a particularly aggressive bird over a sandwich and lost, catastrophically, and laughed about it until he could barely breathe. David watched his children and felt the specific gratitude of a man who knows precisely what he almost lost. He still rises early. This is a habit from his father, who believed that the first hour of the day belongs to you alone, before the world gets its hands on it, before the phone starts, before the demands queue themselves up and begin their patient march. His father would make coffee in the pre-dawn dark and sit at the kitchen table and think, or read, or simply be, and David had inherited this practice, along with the coffee habit, and the work ethic, and the code. These mornings, he walks to a small hill at the edge of a park near his house. A park that was, as it happens, redesigned 3 years ago by a landscape architect whose work he now views with complicated feelings he has mostly made his peace with. He brings his coffee in a thermos, and he sits on a bench at the top of the hill, and he watches the sky change color. He thinks about all of it, sometimes. He lets himself look at the full shape of it, not to punish himself, not to pick at a wound, but because he is a methodical man, and he has found that understanding things clearly, however painful, is better than understanding them partially. He had been too trusting. This is the simple truth at the center of the complicated story, and he has sat with it long enough now to know exactly what it is and what it is not. It is not a condemnation of trust itself. The capacity to love people deeply, to give them your faith without demanding constant proof, is not a weakness. It is, David believes, one of the better features of the human personality, and he has no interest in dismantling it in himself. What he had lacked was discernment, not cynicism, which is the cheap counterfeit of wisdom, but real discernment. The ability to watch, over time, whether the people in your life are who they present themselves to be. Not in the best moments, but in the unguarded ones. Whether their actions, quietly and consistently, match their words. Whether the love they offer you is the kind that makes you larger or the kind that requires your diminishment. He knows the answer now to all of these questions. He knows it in the way you only know things that were taught to you at great cost. He has started something new. Not entirely new. It is still engineering, still the work he loves, still the unglamorous and satisfying discipline of helping companies make things well. But the new firm is structured differently, built on principles he spent 3 months drafting with the care he used to reserve for the company's most important contracts. Transparent governance, genuine accountability, no structure in which a single person's unchecked authority could compromise the whole. Thomas Core is his head of operations. This was not, David has reflected, a difficult decision. He has allowed himself, slowly and without urgency, the ordinary pleasures of a rebuilt life. New friends, some of whom he met through the unlikely community of people who have survived serious business fraud, and formed a kind of battlefield kinship, a deeper relationship with his sister Carol, who was right about everything and has had the grace never to say so. Long phone calls with his mother on Sunday evenings that have become, in their simple constancy, one of the things he is most grateful for in his week. He is not the same man he was before. He does not want to be. The man he was before was good in many ways, but was also, he understands now, too unexamined, too comfortable in his blessings to truly understand them, too surrounded by warmth to know what warmth cost, too certain of the permanence of things to be properly grateful for the ordinary Tuesday evening, the refrigerator covered in drawings, the sound of his children moving through a house. He understands those things now. This morning the sky is doing something extraordinary. It has gone from black to deep blue to a particular shade of violet that has no name he knows, and then, as he watches, it begins to warm from the east. Amber, then rose, then gold spreading through the clouds like a slow fire of the best kind. The city below him is stirring. He can hear it beginning its day. He holds the coffee cup in both hands and feels the warmth of it. He had been afraid, at the worst of it, that what he had lost could not be replaced, that the foundation had been too thoroughly undermined, that what he had built had proven too fragile, that trust itself, the essential substance of every meaningful relationship, every worthwhile endeavor, every human structure worth inhabiting, had been permanently compromised for him, and he would spend the rest of his life building smaller because he could no longer afford to trust the large things. He had been wrong about that. He knows this now. What he had been through had not diminished his capacity for trust. It had refined it, sharpened it, made it something more precise and therefore more powerful. Trust given with eyes open, earned through consistent evidence, weighted by real knowledge of the person who holds it. He has come to believe that the people who betray us reveal something about themselves, not about us, that the decision to give your faith to someone who didn't deserve it does not indict the faith, only the one who wasted it, and that the grief that follows betrayal, real and terrible as it is not the end of the story. It is, if you will let it be, the beginning of the better one. The sun clears the horizon. He watches it. He is David Mercer. He is 43 years old. He has been taken apart and put back together, and what he found in the putting back together was that the essential things were still there. Still solid, still real, still his. His children, his work, his code. Work hard, keep your word, take care of your people. He finishes his coffee. He stands. He walks back down the hill into his life.